But after he made these permutations and combinations, he started using them as symbols, and he used these symbols to represent certain things. So he started making these combinations, but someone has to explain this stuff, right? And the book that explains this stuff is called the I Ching. Hello everyone, many netizens have left messages saying they want to know about the contract in the instruction manual. Why? Because those who have been watching my videos, reading my books, or are my students all know that our own view on the origin of Ziwei Dushu is completely different from the general view, and students who have taken my classes will know that, at the beginning of the course we actually spend a lot of time talking to everyone about the so-called Ziwei Dushu contract. When discussing the origins of fortune telling, it's more important to let everyone know what the origins of fortune telling really are. Why do we need to know this? Because if you want to understand the principles of fortune telling, you also need to understand the historical development behind it. You won't be influenced by incorrect books or common misconceptions because you will genuinely understand the true origin and the fundamental principles of things. Knowing the origin and the underlying principles allows you to discern and distinguish between what is true and what is false. Some information that you encounter might be false and some might be incorrect or misleading. Regarding interpretation, we often say that in our teaching, we sincerely hope everyone doesn't memorize by rote because your life, your understanding, and your wisdom can't be built through memorization alone. Instead, you need to comprehend, to internalize, and to truly grasp the deeper meaning behind the knowledge. Therefore, we will spend a long time explaining the origin of fortune telling to everyone and to understand that fortune telling is actually a very scientific thing. It's just that in the long river of time, in that process that lasted for thousands of years, it could indeed become a kind of knowledge that enables one to wield power. So since it can wield power, it certainly doesn't want everyone to be like it. Otherwise, if everyone is the same, how come I can't seize power, right? So there will be some restrictions, and even a lot of myths and legends will be mixed in to deify him. But when you understand history, you won't have these wrong ideas. You won't be affected by these things. So, because everyone really wants to hear us talk about the historical reasons behind these things, right? So we decided to start with this video. We'll begin to let everyone understand Chinese or Eastern fortune telling to learn its true origins and how it relates to our culture for thousands of years. It's all related to fortune telling. And starting with this video, we will release an English version simultaneously, because we want such a wonderful culture to be known by people all over the world. So starting with this video, we will also release an English version simultaneously so that everyone can better understand our thousands of years of history. A good culture can help many people's skills to be connected with the contracts of Chinese fortune telling. Actually, anyone who has studied within the Chinese speaking system will know that, what is the earliest origin of Chinese characters? Its earliest origin is oracle bone script, right? We now know that the emergence of our writing system is due to the discovery of oracle bone script. But do you know what's actually happening on the oracle bones? The oracle bones, on them, for the vast majority of the oracle bone script characters discovered so far, there are probably, I remember, around 7,000 or 8,000 of them. So what are the main things recorded on them? They're all about worship, they're all about sacrificial rites, and they're all about fortune telling. In other words, they would clearly record things like, hey, today I'm going to war in this place, and this is what happened. And actually, before I went to war, I prayed, and the gods told me what it meant. They were basically recording these kinds of things. So from this, we can understand that for ancient people, the ability to make predictions was an extremely important matter. Just think about it. In a time without sophisticated writing tools, they still had to find ways to leave these records. And why is that? First, of course, the state needed to record these events. Second, it was for keeping accounts. And third, they needed to pass down this skill, this information, so that their descendants could also learn this ability to predict. So you can imagine how important prediction was to them. Just think about it. In ancient times, in the state of primitive people, that era that sounds so mythical, full of myths and all sorts of heroic deeds, like the Yellow Emperor's battle with Chiyu and so on, through movies, comics, and television, they are portrayed as incredibly heroic and godlike. In the end, the Yellow Emperor even ascended to become an immortal. But if you think about it, this is clearly a myth. So what is a myth? A myth is actually humanity's emotional projection onto history, or for things they can't explain, they construct a fictional story. That is the origin of myth. So while we can't treat myths as history, we also don't need to reject or ridicule them, because they are simply the projections made by people of that era about things they didn't understand. But then you realize that these projections can't be real, right? So in that ancient era, who were these people? They were just a bunch of people running around practically naked. Maybe the emperor wore a couple of extra animal skins. Very strong, people running around on the plains. You can't expect them to have been incredibly intelligent or capable. That's practically impossible. They were just a tribe, or a more powerful tribe, or a more organized tribe. So for such an organized tribe, without a written language, how did they record things? In the earlier stages, before they could record things with oracle bone script, they didn't just start writing it from day one, right? There must have been a phase before that. And what was that phase? That earlier phase was what's known as the theory of the correspondence between heaven and humanity. Just think about it. Someone who can't write and has no linguistic ability, like someone who is illiterate with no linguistic ability, how would they express to you what they want to say? They can only use hand gestures, right? And the earliest, clearest information they could access. They can't talk to you about love. They can't discuss emotional things with you, but they can tell you about numbers. Why can they tell you about numbers? Mum, I caught 3 fish today. I'm bringing 3 fish back. 1, 2, 3. 3 fish are back. I can draw 3 lines on a wooden board at home on a stone slab on the wall. And then my mum would know, oh, he caught 3 fish today. Draw 5 lines, that's 5 fish. Sometimes a line might be drawn a bit bigger. One day I caught 4 fish, but one was especially large, so that line was drawn a bit longer. This must be how ancient people started to record things. So it was all built starting from numbers. But just with numbers, isn't it true that you can't explain many things very clearly? But numbers were the earliest thing they could access and the earliest thing they could understand. So they slowly started to build on this, saying, oh, if you draw 1 line and then 10 lines, and then you repeat it, you get 11 lines. When this kind of periodicity started to appear, wasn't that first one a beginning? And what followed was an end, and then a cycle began to emerge. And where did this cycle come from? This cycle came from their understanding of the climate, of the waxing and waning of the moon. They realized, oh, so if I keep drawing these lines, by the time I get to the 15th line, the moon becomes full. And if I draw another 15 lines, the moon disappears again. They would gradually start to have this kind of concept, this idea forming in their minds. In reality, it was actually more likely to be 16 lines, and that would eventually become a repeating cycle. In short, ancient people began to feel, to sense that there were certain cyclical changes happening, and they used these cyclical changes, these repeating patterns, to establish the cyclical changes of these numbers. And slowly, over time, as the years passed, everyone would consolidate this understanding, this knowledge, into a general situation. They discovered that there were many interesting things within numbers, and that numbers could represent many mysterious states. It's like when we were kids reading those wuxia novels. In the novels, Huang Rong and Geng, they go looking for an old woman, right? And the old woman tells them, if you can solve my 9-palace puzzle, then I'll grant you whatever you wish. And in this 9-palace puzzle, she tells them to fill in 9 numbers. And with these 9 numbers, whether you add them diagonally, horizontally, or vertically, the sum is always the same. Where does this come from? In Huang Rong's era, during the Northern Song dynasty, this had actually been developing for a very long time. So what was its predecessor? In fact, its predecessor was when ancient people were writing these numbers, they discovered, wow, these numbers are so magical, they can do this. This is very special. Of course, we have to mention one thing. When they were writing these numbers, they still couldn't write words. There was no script. It was when they were using symbols and numbers to express things that they discovered, oh, there are such magical things between numbers. They can be like this. And slowly, over time, what did this form? This formed what we understand as the earliest origin of numerology, called the He-Tu and Luo Shu. Now, in legend, the He-Tu came from a turtle that crawled out of the sea, with the diagram drawn on its shell. And the Luo Shu came from a horse, one that flew down holding it in its mouth. But in reality, it was just people from that era. They had no writing tools. What could they do? They could only... These messages were inscribed on tortoise shells and animal bone. So the He-Tu river diagram actually originated from the fact that he carved the message on a tortoise shell, which eventually became a myth. We just talked about the construction of myths because the person with this ability needed to rule his tribe, so he had to create a myth. He said that this thing came out of the sea from a tortoise, but in reality, he carved the message on the cabinet, which was probably left to him by his father, who told him this myth. The Luo Shu is actually carved on animal bones, such as horse bones or something. After I carved these trees, I gradually made some records. In addition, in ancient times, in addition to observing changes in the environment, besides the changes in the sun, moon, and stars, I'm now counting 90 days. I've noticed the climate changes, so I'll record it. So next time I calculate this time, I'll tell you, oh, it's going to snow in 90 days. Wouldn't that be amazing? Then I can transform into the tribe's shaman. People would think, wow, I'm so amazing. So that's how it originated. Besides environmental changes, for example, by observing the phases of the moon, you can know about the tides, and then you can know whether there are many fish at that time. So can't you also make predictions? 2 weeks later, oh, back then there were no Sundays. And then they said maybe a few days later, the fish would swim over. And everyone would say, wow, you're so amazing. You can predict things, right? If you want to gain power and make money, you'll definitely say, this is what the gods told me. The gods told me when it will come. And that's how you achieve deification. Under these circumstances, he gradually, because he wanted to pass this on to his children, another theory is called the theory of divine intervention. A feeling suddenly came to my mind. What will happen today? It's not that I suddenly felt uneasy when I went out today, and then something actually happened, so I wrote it down. But not everyone has this feeling, or even those who do, don't always have such a clear understanding of the situation. What do they do then? They took the tortoise shell and animal bones and placed them over a fire to observe the cracks that appeared. Then record it. And what about the conditions that caused these cracks? Later, it was also converted into hieroglyphs and some symbols. This scene appears in the second episode of The Investiture of the Gods. After he takes the Guojia element and tests it, the whole country cracks. So he says that the dynasty is going to perish because the whole thing is collapsing. So the ancients would do this, and then they would crack and roar, and then they would start to record it. These things slowly and slowly roar. As the amount of information increased and the operational methods became more refined, he began to organize it into text. Some of it was organized into pure symbols, which were then used to represent certain things. These symbols originated from the numbers we just discussed, combined with some of their text, and were gradually organized. What are these symbols? The longer one in the chain is called the yang, while the two shorter ones, or the one that is broken, are called the yin. The combination of yin and yang represents the ancients' understanding that there is day and night, men and women in the world, and that there is a bright side and a dark side. They began to discover that things are long and short, complete and broken. The ancients began to understand. This world could be classified to a certain degree. So it formed this symbol of yin and yang, and from this symbol they then made permutations and combinations. This is what we traditionally consider the so-called Xiantian Bagua, or early heaven Bagua. It was created through permutations and combinations. From this Xiantian Bagua, more variations led to what we call the 64 hexagrams. That is to say, they used these 64. They used the most basic yin and yang. Yang is like a rod, and yin, it has a hole like that. This is the ancients' observation of basic biology. Of course, you can put it that way, and it's actually possible that's how it was. But after he made these permutations and combinations, he started using them as symbols, and he used these symbols to represent certain things. So he started making these combinations. But someone has to explain this stuff, right? And the book that explains this stuff is called the I Ching, because he made all sorts of messages, just like we said earlier. After Oracle Bone script appeared, they started making many, many historical records. And then within these records, as we slowly developed methods for prediction, I needed to see those symbols. And these symbols, I needed to pass them on to the next generation. I needed to organize them into a system. And for this systematic thing, I also had to let people know how I was going to interpret it. So a series of operations, a series of accumulated wisdom, eventually formed what we now know as the I Ching and the 64 hexagram. It contains the ancients' observations of the cycles of heaven and earth, and when you couldn't observe the cycles, you had to rely on the interaction between heaven and humanity, and then suddenly cast a hexagram to see what heaven wanted to tell me. It simultaneously contained these two functions. By the spring and autumn and warring states periods, the versions of the I Ching were already numerous. When I was a kid in school, I heard that there were many versions of the I Ching to explain it, including Confucius. He also went and interpreted the I Ching. During the Han Dynasty, a person appeared, a prodigal son of the Han Dynasty called Emperor Wu of Han. For the sake of governance, he dismissed the 100 schools of thought and exclusively revered Confucianism. But Confucius's principle was not to speak of the supernatural, violence, or chaos. Confucius didn't talk about fortune-telling. Confucius was someone who helped people with worship rituals, His job was more like a ritual master. No. In Taiwan, ritual masters are the sexy kind. Confucius was more like a master of ceremonies for grand events, in charge of etiquette and such. So Confucius didn't pursue this stuff. When Confucius was annotating the I Ching, he would be more inclined to use it to talk about the great principles of life. So in the process of annotation, some people lean towards using it for fortune-telling, others they lean towards using it for life principles, and some lean towards using it for governing the country. It just depended on their status, how they interpreted this thing. by the time of Emperor Wu of Han, because he dismissed the 100 schools of thought and revered only Confucianism. The only things he kept were the I Ching and what else, and some medical books. So since he dismissed the 100 schools, you can imagine whose version of the I Ching would be left. He revered only Confucianism, right? So only Confucius's version would remain. So most of what we read today is Confucius's version, but don't think that Confucius's version is the only one. It's not. In fact, there are many versions of it. Why is that? Because Confucius himself actually didn't leave any written records. His students were the ones who left them. So when we talk about the writings of Confucius, it actually refers to the things he worked on with his students. You have to remember, in an era when writing tools were not advanced, a lot of things, well, they could be recorded very simply, or they could be carved incorrectly, or remembered incorrectly, or they could be mistaken in all sorts of ways. And then, even if something was correct, it could be damaged by insects, eaten by bugs. So there were actually all kinds of versions. And within these versions, some students felt that fortune-telling was very important, so their versions would lean a bit towards divination. Other parts would lean more towards discussing the principles of life. But of course, regardless, because the I Ching was passed down, the techniques for using it for divination were naturally passed down as well. And as we just mentioned, what is the main divination function of the I Ching? It's the theory of the interaction between heaven and humanity. If I go out today, what might I encounter? Heaven will tell me. But not everyone has this kind of intuitive ability, so I need a method. And this method involves seeing what happens when I take a turtle shell or an animal bone and roast it over a fire. Every time you roast it, the shape is different. Eventually, I slowly organize these into about 64 different patterns. But isn't it a hassle to roast them every time? And where's the hassle? It's not the fire, it's the turtle, of course. You have to kill a turtle every time, get a bone every time. Isn't that a lot of trouble, right? Do you think the ancients were like us? That they could just go buy some fried chicken and use the leftover chicken breastbone to roast? It wasn't that simple for them. So to make this technique more convenient, they made them into bamboo slips. I don't need to roast them over a fire, and I don't need to kill these animals. Anyway, what I want is to know which message is likely to appear. So I might as well take these messages, organize them, and make them into 64 slips, and then I can draw one, then I'll know what heaven wants to tell me. And after drawing a slip, who helps me interpret it? The ancients left behind a book called the I Ching for us to interpret it. And this book, as it was passed down on, as we said, it started with tribes. As the population grew, the organization became larger and more complex. And as it got more complex, weren't there more and more things to explain? And with more to explain, the book got thicker and thicker and thicker, until we finally get to what we see now, which is what we consider to be a very significant and influential book in the entire Chinese cultural sphere, a book that tells us how to live our lives, which is, of course, the I Ching. Our entire system of medicine, divination, and many other cultural aspects all use this as their foundation. The reason is that it originally recorded thousands of years of life experience, and it used this life experience to become a set of principles for our lives, a guide for our lives. And similarly, it can also be used to let us know, hey, what heaven wants to tell us. Just like how Christians use the Bible as a guide for their lives. So when they want to know what God wants to tell them, what do? They just open the Bible, they flip to a page, and this chapter, this verse is telling me something. Wow, this is what God wants to tell me. And what about us? For us, we draw lots. We draw one, and this is a certain hexagram. Then we look it up in the I Ching, see what the explanation is, and this is what heaven wants to tell us. Actually, if you think about it, isn't the whole process exactly the same? It's just like when we go to a temple to pray, right? We draw a fortune stick and then get the fortune slip interpreted. It's exactly the same. This is the most fundamental origin of Chinese numerology. And so later on, as things became more and more complex and more specialized, from the Western Han all the way to the Eastern Han dynasty, it underwent a major reform. However, this technique was preserved all along in the temples, becoming our fortune stick containers. It was preserved and passed to Japan. In Japan, their fortune-telling also uses the I Ching, but their method is not quite the same as the one we use now. Their method is the same as the one used before the late Eastern Han dynasty. Japan has a very famous numerologist named Takashima Donsho, the founder of Takashimaya. Now, you might not know this, but during the shogunate era in Japan, their samurai all had to study the 4 books and 5 classics, And if you study the 4 books and 5 classics, you'll study the I Ching. So this Takashima Donsho, during the Bakumatsu period, anyone who knows a bit of Japanese history would know the Bakumatsu period, wasn't that the time of revere the emperor, expel the barbarians, and the restoration of imperial rule? People felt that the Tokugawa clan could no longer control the country, could no longer help Japan resist foreign threats, and the nation wouldn't progress. so they hoped for all the domains to unite and let the emperor take the lead, and to make Japan a unified nation, to gather everyone's strength to resist the Western powers. And in this process, of course, there were supporters and opponents, right? And the Takashima family, they were one of the opposing families. In the end, after the Satsuma rebellion, the Satsuma domain was defeated. And after the defeat, he was put in prison. The samurai of that era all had to study the 4 books and 5 classics, right? When he was in prison with nothing to do, he brought 2 volumes of the I Ching with him, the upper and lower volumes, 2 books. He was imprisoned for 7 years. After seriously studying those 2 books, when he got out, he was basically a down-and-out nobleman because his family's assets had been confiscated. So what did he do? He set up a stall on the street to tell fortunes and sell some general goods on the side. That general store later became the Takashimaya we know today. But he was of noble birth after all. So he had many old friends from his past, including Ito Hirobumi, who was also a good friend of his. And as he kept telling fortunes, he naturally got the chance to do it for these high-ranking officials and nobles, and then he started to become famous. Legend has it that during the Sino-Japanese War, what our history books call the First Sino-Japanese War, they call it the Nishin War. Legend says that during the Nishin War, he was the national preceptor of Japan at the time. He used divination to tell Ito Hirobumi how the war should be fought. The method he used was the I Ching. What's popular in Japan now is using the I Ching for divination and using a very ancient method of I Ching divination. How ancient is it? In this episode, I'll tell you a little story about this Takashima Donsho. Of course, you can go back and try it out, see if this method is particularly effective. It's said that Takashima Donsho, when he performed divination, because they draw lots, right? He'd shake and shake and shake, and a stick would come out. How did he shake it? When he shook the container, he would hold his breath, temporarily stop breathing, not breathing at all. When you don't breathe, after a while, don't you feel like you're about to die, right? Right at that moment when you're about to die, but not yet dead, the stick, pop, comes out. He believed that stick was the most accurate one. Why? Because when a person is about to die, but not yet dead, at that moment, it's when you die, your soul leaves, right? If divination is based on the theory of heaven-human connection, that it's your soul communicating with the universe to get information, then shouldn't you let your soul be free from the control of your body? So at the moment when a person is about to die, but not yet dead, the soul is about to leave. The information he receives at this time will be the most accurate. I read this in his autobiography. He'd hold his breath, and when he was about to pass out, about to die, pop, the stick comes out. This is the most accurate one. And then he'd use that stick for interpretation. So for those of you who do divination, you can all try this method and see if it's particularly effective. When you're drawing tarot cards, first, don't breathe. When you're about to die, quickly draw 3 cards or 4 cards. That's supposed to be the most accurate. You can try it out, you can try it out. This kind of technique was passed down to Japan. Now in Taiwan, in our Chinese-speaking regions, is this technique still used? It's most similar to what's used in temples. Or some, like I myself also use this method. I also draw lots. However, from the middle Han Dynasty through the middle period to the end, this form of divination underwent a major reform, which made this technique even better and more widely used. If you're interested, please help me by liking, subscribing, and sharing. And your encouragement is the motivation for me to keep going. It's only going to get more exciting. I'll tell you all how the methods from that very, very primitive era slowly transformed into the fortune-telling methods we use today. In fact, all the modern fortune-telling methods, you know, were completed during the Ming and Qing dynasties. What was the process of change in between? And in those early times, we often read in books about observing celestial phenomena. So did they have astrology back then? Was there a Chinese form of astrology? Actually, there was. How did astrology develop at that time? We will gradually help everyone understand this very, very interesting story. And this process of change was actually a process of great cultural fusion. It's very, very interesting. All right, thank you, everyone.